And getting back to what we were talking about earlier and the relationship between our world food system and the petroleum industry, one way to just illustrate that is that there's all kinds of estimates, and I think the one that I'm going to use right now is pretty conservative, but for every 1 calorie that we consume, it takes at least 7 to 10 calories of fossil fuels to bring us that 1 calorie. Right. And some estimates are much higher than that. It depends on the food that we're eating. That's just a general. That's just an average.
And yeah, I've certainly heard that, you know, education and contraceptives, you know, economic and educational empowerment for women, you know, those are the real keys to dealing with population. But I think at the same time, you know, we're talking about needing to be able to feed 7 to 9 billion people in the coming years, and we're facing this oil crisis. We may not be able to produce all this food. But I mean, sometimes we talk about population and it's not, the issue of consumption is kind of not as much focused on, and often some people argue that when we talk about population, that kind of puts the burden on poor countries, when really in terms of environmental damage and consumption of food and waste of energy and resources, I mean, developed nations like the United States are arguably more of a problem in a way.
we are probably one of the biggest problems right now. I mean, we're consuming about 50% of the world's energy right now. We're only 5%.
We're only 5%.
Well, okay, 25% of the
25 to 30. I think it's 25 to 30.
Between there, we'll find it. It's astronomical.
It's huge,
compared to 5% of the population. Right. It really is here in the developed world. We're making the decisions that really affect the rest of the world. Now, I had a conversation with somebody over the break over something very trivial about the food that they eat. And this person didn't really seem to care about the food that they ate. And it kind of startled me that they were more kind of selfish and narcissistic about, you know, eating food that they like, rather than food that's good for them and doesn't have such a harsh impact on the environment.
It's interesting you talk about like people and how they react when you talk about the issue of food and what we eat, and some people get up in arms about, well, you know, I want to be able to eat whatever I want. But what's interesting, I was talking about this in a philosophy class, is that really people argue that they like certain foods because of how they taste, but really taste is no different than smell. Like, I mean, they're totally interrelated. So, I mean, we're essentially destroying the environment and threatening our children's future for essentially the way something smells. I mean, taste is not much different than smell at all. They're totally related. I mean, it's actually the vapors that go across your tongue that's part of the reason you taste things. And
yeah,
so,
about 70 to 80% of our taste is from what we smell.
Right. So, I mean, we're essentially willing to sacrifice the future of our planet and our children for the smell of a certain food over another, and it's pretty unbelievable. I guess we have certain internal addictions too to sugars and fats and things like that. But I mean, you know, it's pretty interesting.
That's an interesting way of saying that.
Yeah.
Well, the American diet is unique in the fact we eat a lot of meat, and it's all corn fed for the most part.
Well, I think it's about half of it is half of it is grass fed, and then half is like fed in these feedlots.
Well, a lot of them end up in the feedlots eventually anyway. They're all getting to the feedlots, the finishing lots for corn. You know, just to talk about cows because they're the big problem. A lot of these cows that we have in these feedlots, they can't stand more than 90 days in them. So it's good that they slaughter them when they do. You know, cows are meant to eat corn. They're a ruminant. They actually eat grass. And after about 90 days of eating corn, a cow will die. It will die. And
the stomach gets too acidic.
Well, the problem is we're eating this. And the hamburgers that we're eating are actually very well disguised fat, looking like meat. And what it is that we're really just eating a whole lot of corn in our diet when it comes through. I had a professor had a screening of King Corn, which is a really good documentary. I hope people watch it. It really brings it home. All the food byproducts from just one crop, you know, that we derive here in the United States. It makes our diet so unique.
Yeah, I was amazed to learn along those lines. Just how integral the subsidies of grain industry are to keeping the CAFOs going, the factory farms.
Confined animal feeding operations.
Yes, exactly. And how they really couldn't sustain themselves if we didn't have those subsidies, you know. And just how you know, the government through these subsidies are interfering with the natural workings of capitalism.
Right. Well, we talk about the free market, but
Absolutely.
as soon as you talk about subsidies, you don't have a free market. I mean, and not that I believe in the free market anyway, but I mean, people that say they believe in the free market are providing tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to not only give them directly to these factory farmed meat production, but they also give billions in indirect subsidies through subsidizing the corn that they feed to the animals. So they're doubly subsidizing these corporate
and you know,
farms.
I think originally these subsidies meant well, you know, but too much of a good thing becomes a really bad thing. And really, what we have now is socialized
meat consumption.
Yeah, we're socializing corporations.
Corporate
basically.
socialism,
Yeah,
corporate
exactly.
welfare. Yeah, absolutely. And if you
I'd like to
jump in
point
there,
out
tell me.
one of the problems with the amount of meat, specifically cattle, that we produce. When you take that grain or the grass, whatever plant matter that you feed to an animal that then goes on to feed a human, you only maintain 10% of the energy as you increase in trophic level. So whatever energy was available in that corn, only 10% of it is passed on to a cow. And then when we consume that beef, only 10% of the energy in the cow is then transferred to the human. So if you started out with 100 calories, 10 calories would be passed on to the cow, and only 1 calorie would make it for the human. Now, if we're talking about feeding our exploding population, it makes sense that if we cut out the animal in the middle and shift towards a more vegetarian diet, we'd be able to feed more people.
It's much more efficient.
Right. There was a Cornell ecology professor, David Pimentel. He's a sort of a leader in criticizing industrial agriculture, the way we do it, especially confined animal feeding operations, the factory farms of meat. And he says that if we ate the amount of grain that we feed to animals, it would actually feed 800 million people instead of 300 million.
That's interesting because there's 800 to 900 million people in the world that are clinically hungry.
Right. So yeah, I mean, we're willing to let people starve to death so we can, you know, dump grain in the faces of animals so we can have better smelling food on our plate. But it was interesting too. I think one statistic is that it takes, for these factory farms where we're dumping grain in the faces of animals, it takes 13 to 16 pounds of grain to make a pound of beef, and then 3 pounds of grain to make a pound of chicken. So it's a little more efficient to do chicken or fish. But and you had one statistic, wasn't it? That it's actually higher, even 20 pounds of grain?
It's really, if you want to be honest, because we don't use the whole cow and we waste a lot of the grain. You're talking almost about 20 pounds of grain used to produce a pound of beef.
Is that because it includes the bones? And
I mean,
basically,
the
other statistic it does. I mean,
and we're wasting, a lot of the grain actually gets wasted. It doesn't talk about the grain that gets wasted in the whole process. And I mean, and then you got about 7.5 for pork, 3.5 for chicken.
So yeah, I think it's
3 for a fish.
About half the grain we grow in the U.S. is fed to animals.
Yes.
So that's pretty amazing to me. And it also, one other statistic was that it takes 100,000 liters of water to make 1 kilogram of beef. And so, I mean, it's amazing to me. I mean,
one more on that. Another good one. You're talking. It's almost about 67 square feet of land to make about a hamburger. About 1 hamburger, 60. And now this is a statistic, of course. We're not talking but I mean that's what you're looking at. About, you know, your 1 hamburger is taking about 67 square feet of land for your consumption.
And I think by far the most important thing to keep in mind when we talk about animal agriculture and meat production and CAFOs, factory farming of meat, is so in 2006 we had a major UN report said that actually 18% of global warming emissions were coming from animal agriculture, and that exceeded the transportation sector at 13%. So we're actually having more climate change emissions coming from agriculture, than animal agriculture, meat production, than transportation. A lot of people talk about transportation and homes, and we need to be more efficient, but actually it's arguable that, you know, what we're putting in our mouths is having more of an impact. And now a new report by the World Bank says that the UN was actually underestimating a lot of these statistics, and actually over half of climate change emissions are coming from meat production. And this is unbelievable. I mean, so if we stopped eating meat, it would probably be stop eating as much meat, especially beef, especially confined, you know, the factory farmed beef. That would probably be the single biggest thing we could do to deal with climate change, and that's not hardly even talked about. We're having Obama go to this Copenhagen summit to talk about climate change. I would imagine that the subject of meat consumption may not even be talked about. I hope it is.